What happens when a respected doctor's dark secret is brought to light? Dr. Henry Lawson is known for his skill and success, but beneath the surface, his prejudice has cost patients their chance at proper care. Enter Sarah Collins, an undercover FBI agent determined to expose him. What begins as a mission for justice quickly turns into something more: a high-stakes confrontation, a life-or-death crisis, and an unexpected journey toward redemption. Can Dr. Lawson change, or will his past destroy everything he's built? And will Sarah's fight for fairness create a brighter future for her community and her unborn child? Before we jump into this powerful story, comment below where you're watching from and tell us, can people truly change? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will make you think twice. Dr. Henry Lawson strode through the hallways of Crestwood Hospital, his polished shoes echoing off the white tiles. The air was cool, carrying the familiar, sharp scent of antiseptic that he had long since learned to associate with success and control. Around him, the hospital hummed with activity, doctors consulting in hushed tones, nurses checking on patients, the distant beep of monitoring equipment. Crestwood was one of the finest hospitals in the state, and Dr. Lawson was proud to be its star surgeon. As he passed a group of nurses, he caught snippets of their conversation: a new trauma patient in the ER, a complicated childbirth in the maternity ward. He barely registered their voices, his focus already on the day ahead. His white coat was crisp and perfectly pressed, a symbol of his status, his untouchable reputation. The nurses glanced his way, offering polite nods, their expressions a mix of deference and a touch of apprehension. He was used to it, respected, but distant. Dr. Lawson had always been careful to maintain that distance. It was better that way. Personal connections only complicated things, made it harder to keep emotions out of his work. He was a surgeon, a man who prided himself on his precision, his ability to stay detached, even in the face of life and death. He had built his career on that reputation, never wavering, never hesitating. As he entered the doctor's lounge, he spotted Dr. Susan Patel, a younger surgeon with a bright smile and a reputation for empathy that he considered a weakness. She approached him with a patient file clutched in her hands, her expression serious. "Dr. Lawson," she began, her voice tinged with concern. "We've got a young patient in the ER, Terrell Brooks, 22 years old. He's complaining of severe chest pains radiating to his left arm. It could be serious." "Let me see the file," Lawson interrupted, holding out his hand. Susan hesitated before handing it over, watching as his sharp eyes scanned the details. Terrell Brooks, unemployed, African American. He felt his lip curl slightly, though he kept his expression neutral. "Probably just a case of anxiety or some indigestion," he said dismissively, handing the file back to her. "Give him a sedative and some antacids, and send him on his way." Dr. Patel frowned, glancing back toward the ER. "But Dr. Lawson, he has a family history of heart disease. I really think we should run an EKG, just to be sure." Dr. Lawson's gaze hardened, his voice turning icy. "Are you questioning my judgment, Doctor?" "Patel, we have limited resources and I don't intend to waste them on every young man who walks in with a stomachache." Susan hesitated, a flicker of frustration crossing her face, but she knew better than to argue. "Yes, Dr. Lawson, I'll take care of it." As she turned and left, Lawson felt a faint sense of satisfaction. He had made the right decision, as he always did. There was no point in wasting time on cases that didn't warrant his expertise. He had a full schedule: elective surgeries, consultations with patients who mattered, people who could pay. But as he walked back to his office, a shadow of discomfort lingered in his mind. He dismissed it quickly, telling himself that this was just how things worked. Some patients deserved more of their time than others. Setting: Sarah's home, early evening. The house is small but cozy, decorated with family photos and baby essentials. Outside, the wind howls, carrying the first hint of winter. Sarah Collins stood in her kitchen, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other stirring a pot of soup on the stove. The rhythmic motion calmed her, but her thoughts were far from the warmth of her home. At 6 months pregnant, she was acutely aware of every change in her body, each flutter and kick reminding her that soon she would be bringing a new life into the world. She turned off the stove and walked over to the living room, easing herself onto the worn couch. A framed photo on the coffee table caught her eye, her mother holding her when she was just a baby. Her mother's smile was gentle, but Sarah remembered the struggle behind that smile all too well. Growing up, Sarah had watched her mother fight to get proper medical care in a system that seemed designed to ignore her. As a black woman in a small town, her mother had been brushed off by doctors, told that her pain was in her head, that she was overreacting. Sarah could still remember the long hours in clinic waiting rooms, the tightness in her mother's voice as she tried to explain her symptoms to doctors who never seemed to listen. Her mother's struggle was what had driven Sarah to join the FBI. She had wanted to be in a position to make a difference, to bring justice to people who needed it most. But now, with her own child on the way, the weight of that responsibility felt heavier than ever. She rubbed her belly, feeling the reassuring flutter of her baby's movements. "Don't worry, little one," she whispered. "I'm going to make sure you grow up in a world that's better than this one, a world where you'll be treated fairly." Her phone rang, cutting through the quiet. It was her supervisor, Agent Mark Thompson. She answered, her voice steady despite the tension she felt building in her chest. "Agent Collins," Thompson said, his tone brisk. "I've got a new assignment for you. There's a doctor at Crestwood Hospital, Dr. Henry Lawson. We've received multiple complaints about him, particularly from patients of color. Neglect, dismissive treatment, some allegations of outright discrimination." Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. She had heard of Dr. Lawson, a well-respected heart surgeon, known for his precision and skill. But she had also heard rumors about his bias, whispers from families who had been turned away without care. "What do you need from me?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain calm. "We need you to go undercover, posing as a patient," Thompson said. "We need evidence, something concrete that will hold up against his reputation. He's got friends in high places, so we'll have to tread carefully." Sarah glanced at the photo of her mother again, then down at her own growing belly. This wasn't just another case. It was personal. It was a chance to confront the kind of prejudice that had hurt her mother and that could one day hurt her child. "I'll do it," she said, her voice filled with determination. "Whatever it takes." Sarah adjusted the collar of her plain maternity blouse, taking a deep breath as she stepped into Crestwood Hospital. She had prepared for this moment, studying every detail of her cover story. Emily Parker, a first-time mother, nervous about her pregnancy. But as she looked around at the sleek, modern hospital with its gleaming floors and glass walls, she couldn't help feeling a prickle of unease. She walked up to the reception desk, where a nurse with a polite smile handed her a clipboard. "Welcome to Crestwood, Mrs. Parker. Dr. Lawson will see you shortly." Sarah forced a smile, clutching the clipboard as she filled out the intake form. The act of writing her fake name felt surreal, but she reminded herself why she was here. "This is for all the people who never got the care they deserved," she thought, glancing around the waiting room. "It's for my baby." A few minutes later, she was ushered into Dr. Lawson's office. The room was elegant, with dark wood shelves lined with medical books, framed diplomas, and photographs of Dr. Lawson shaking hands with various dignitaries, state senators, the mayor, even a former president. It was clear that he had cultivated a reputation, not just as a surgeon, but as a man who moved in powerful circles. Dr. Lawson barely looked up as she entered, his eyes fixed on her chart. He was tall and sharply dressed, his white coat immaculate. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his expression was one of distant professionalism. "Mrs. Parker, is it?" he said, finally glancing up. His tone was polite but impersonal, as if he had already made up his mind about her before she had even spoken. "What seems to be the problem?" Sarah took a seat across from him, trying to keep her expression neutral. "I've been feeling a lot of discomfort lately, doctor. It's my first pregnancy, and I'm just worried. I want to make sure everything is okay." Dr. Lawson's eyes flicked over her, lingering for a moment on her skin tone before returning to the chart. His smile was thin, almost condescending. "I'm sure it's nothing serious. Normal pregnancy aches and pains. Nothing to be concerned about." Sarah kept her tone light, even as anger simmered beneath the surface. "I was hoping you might run some tests, just to be safe. I've heard that high blood pressure can be dangerous during pregnancy, and I'd like to be sure." Dr. Lawson let out an exasperated sigh, leaning back in his chair. Mrs. Parker, women have been having babies for thousands of years. A little discomfort is perfectly normal. If you're really worried, you can schedule some tests with the nurse on your way out. But I assure you, it's not necessary. He stood, clearly dismissing her, and Sarah fought to keep the frustration out of her voice. Thank you for your time, doctor. Lawson, I'll think about it. As she left his office, she caught a glimpse of his satisfied expression reflected in the glass door, as if he had just dismissed an insignificant problem. She forced herself to keep walking, her hands clenched tightly around her purse. You won't be rid of me that easily, doctor. Lawson, she thought as she headed down the hallway. You'll see me again. And next time, I'll be holding all the cards. Sarah sat in her temporary office at the FBI field headquarters, surrounded by stacks of patient files and handwritten notes. The dim light of the desk lamp cast long shadows across the room, making the space feel smaller, more suffocating. The weight of the stories she had read pressed down on her, each one a reminder of the lives that had been dismissed, neglected. She picked up the file labeled Maria Hernandez and flipped through the pages, skimming the notes she had taken. Maria had been one of the first patients to come forward to a young mother who had lost her baby after Dr. Lawson dismissed her symptoms as normal pregnancy discomfort. Sarah met Maria at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, choosing a quiet corner where they wouldn't be overheard. Maria sat across from her, wringing her hands nervously. Her eyes were puffy from crying, her face drawn with exhaustion. He barely even looked at me, Maria said, her voice cracking as she spoke. I told him I was in pain, that something didn't feel right. He just smiled and said it was all in my head, that I was overreacting. By the time another doctor saw me, it was too late. Maria's voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Sarah reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on Maria's arm. I'm so sorry, Maria. I can't imagine how hard this has been for you, Sarah said softly. But your story's important. It's going to help us make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Maria looked up, her eyes filled with desperate hope. Do you really think it will make a difference? Do you think he'll ever have to pay for what he did? Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to sound confident. Yes, I promise you, Maria, we're going to hold him accountable. But as she walked back to her car that night, her own doubts gnawed at her. She thought about her own unborn child, about the world they would inherit. She knew that people like Dr. Lawson had powerful friends, that justice wasn't always guaranteed. But she also knew she couldn't give up. Dr. Lawson was on edge, and he didn't like it. He had noticed that Emily Parker, his new patient, was spending a lot of time around the hospital, too much time. It seemed like every time he turned a corner, there she was, chatting with a nurse or lingering near the ER. He found himself watching her more closely, wondering what she was up to. She had seemed so meek, so unassuming during their appointment, but now he wasn't so sure. He started asking questions of his own, speaking to the nurses, trying to piece together why she kept coming back. Mrs. Parker's been asking a lot of questions about you, Nurse Linda, an older woman who had worked at Crestwood for years, mentioned one afternoon. She wanted to know about your schedule, your other patients. I thought it was a little strange. Dr. Lawson forced a laugh, trying to mask his unease. She's probably just a nervous, first-time mother. They tend to get obsessive about these things. But Linda's words lingered in his mind long after their conversation ended. He knew there was more to it than that. And as he passed Emily Parker, or whoever she was, in the hallway that afternoon, he couldn't shake the sense that she was hiding something. Sarah noticed his growing suspicion, the way his gaze lingered on her when they passed each other in the hallways. She knew she was running out of time. Her conversations with the staff had yielded useful information. Testimonies of other patients, hints of altered records. But it wasn't enough yet. She needed more, and she needed it soon. Back in her temporary office, she spread out the files she had collected. Tyrell Brooks, Maria Hernandez, James Wright. Each name represented a life impacted by Dr. Lawson's negligence. She could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of their stories pressing down on her shoulders. Just a little longer, she thought. her hands trembling as she sorted through the evidence. I'm almost there. Dr. Lawson sat at his desk, absently turning a gold pen between his fingers. Outside, snow swirled against the window panes, turning the hospital's manicured lawn into a blank, white canvas. He glanced at the clock, noting the time. Emily Parker was due for her follow-up appointment in just a few minutes. He remembered her insistence on extra tests, the anxious questions she had asked. Something about her had unsettled him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. A knock sounded at the door, and his assistant's voice came through the intercom. Dr. Lawson, your 3:30 is here. Send her in, he replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. The door swung open, and Sarah walked in. She looked different, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. There was no trace of the nervous energy she had shown before. Dr. Lawson felt a flicker of unease. He set his pen down, folding his hands on the desk in front of him. Mrs. Parker, he said, leaning back in his chair, what seems to be the problem this time? Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small leather badge holder. With a snap, she flipped it open, revealing her FBI credentials. Actually, Dr. Lawson, my name is Sarah Collins. I'm an agent with the FBI, and I've been investigating you for the past 2 months. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, as cold and unyielding as the winter wind outside. Dr. Lawson stared at the badge, his mind racing to catch up with what she was saying. What the hell is this? He demanded, but his voice wavered, betraying the fear that coiled in his chest. Sarah's expression was steely, her eyes locked onto his. This is an investigation into your discriminatory practices, doctor. We have multiple testimonies from former patients. Cases you dismissed, symptoms you ignored. I've gathered enough evidence to suggest a pattern of negligence, indiscrimination, and you're facing serious consequences. Dr. Lawson's hands tightened into fists, his knuckles turning white. He rose from his chair, towering over Sarah, his face flushed with anger. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I have friends in this town, people who won't look kindly on some FBI agent trying to ruin my career. One phone call and you'll be off this case before you know it. But Sarah didn't flinch. She held her ground, meeting his fury with calm determination. Maybe you do have friends, Dr. Lawson, but I have something stronger. Evidence. I have altered medical records, patient testimonies, and enough documentation to make sure this investigation sticks. Dr. Lawson's mouth opened and closed, his mind struggling to process the scope of what she was saying. For years, he had operated under the assumption that he was untouchable, that his reputation would shield him from any consequences. But now, faced with the reality of what Sarah had uncovered, he felt that carefully constructed facade began to crack. What do you want from me? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a question he had never imagined he would ask, a question that tasted bitter on his tongue. Sarah's expression softened slightly, though her resolve remained unyielding. I want you to make amends, Doctor. Lawson, you have a choice. Either face the consequences of your actions in court, or start making things right by giving back to the community you've neglected. She slid a folder across his desk, filled with documents outlining the conditions of her proposal. Community service at Bright Future Orphanage, free medical care for those who couldn't afford it, and a substantial donation to support underfunded clinics. Dr. Lawson stared down at the folder, feeling a surge of resentment rise in his chest. He wanted to refuse, to throw her and her evidence out of his office, but he could see in her eyes that she wouldn't back down. He thought of the articles that would run in the papers, the whispers among his colleagues, the shame that would follow him like a shadow. Finally, he picked up the folder, feeling the weight of it in his hands. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. I'll do it. But don't think for a second that I'm doing this because I believe in your crusade. Sarah's expression remained impassive, but a flicker of relief crossed her eyes. It doesn't matter why you're doing it, Doctor, only that you do. Later that night, Sarah sat in her living room, her hands resting protectively on her belly as she spoke with Agent Thompson over the phone. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside the house was warm, filled with the scent of pine from the small Christmas tree they had set up in the corner. So he agreed to it? Thompson's voice crackled through the line, edged with skepticism. He did, Sarah replied, shifting to get more comfortable on the couch. But he's not happy about it. He sees it as a way to protect his reputation, not as a chance for redemption. Thompson sighed. I hope you know what you're doing, Sarah. People like Lawson, they don't change easily. If he thinks you're trying to ruin his life, he could make things difficult for you. Sarah glanced over at the small crib in the corner, her thoughts drifting towards her unborn child. I know, but I had to give him the chance. Maybe he'll surprise us. As she ended the call, she leaned back, exhaustion settling into her bones. She had known from the beginning that this wouldn't be easy, but she clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, Dr. Lawson could become a better man. Across town, Dr. Lawson paced the marble floors of his mansion, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger and shame. His home was a testament to his success. Priceless art on the walls, antique furniture, a view of the city skyline from the floor-to-ceiling windows. But tonight the house felt empty, its silence pressing down on him like a weight. He poured himself a glass of scotch, the amber liquid swirling in the crystal tumbler. He took a long sip, but it did nothing to dull the anxiety gnawing at his chest. He thought of the folder Sarah had given him, the conditions he had reluctantly accepted. Volunteering at a rundown orphanage, giving free care to patients who couldn't pay. It was beneath him, an insult to his years of hard work. She doesn't understand, he thought bitterly. She doesn't know what it's like to fight for everything, to build a reputation that can't be touched. But even as he tried to justify his anger, a small voice whispered in the back of his mind, reminding him of the faces of the patients he had dismissed, of the quiet fear in their eyes. He shoved the thought away, focusing instead on the cold fire of resentment that burned in his chest. Yet as the night dragged on, his bravado faltered, leaving only a hollow sense of unease. He knew that he had no choice but to go through with Sarah's demands. But the idea of facing those children, of seeing the consequences of his neglect up close, made his stomach churn with dread. With a final, frustrated sigh, he picked up his phone and dialed Sarah's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm despite the lateness of the hour. I'll do it, he said, the words bitter on his tongue. I'll volunteer at the orphanage, but don't expect me to enjoy it. Sarah's response was steady, unwavering. Just show up, doctor. Lawson, the rest will follow. Bright Future Orphanage stood on the edge of a neighborhood that time seemed to have forgotten. The buildings were old and worn, their paint faded, windowsills chipped. The sidewalks were cracked, lined with stubborn patches of ice that refused to melt even under the pale winter sun. Dr. Lawson pulled up in front of the orphanage, his luxury sedan looking out of place among the battered cars and rusted bicycles that lined the street. He stepped out of the car, pulling his coat tighter against the biting wind. The orphanage loomed before him, a weathered brick building with faded letters spelling out its name above the door. He could hear the faint sounds of children's laughter from somewhere inside, mingling with the distant hum of traffic. As he approached the entrance, a stout woman with a warm smile stepped out to greet him. Sister Evelyn Matthews was dressed in a simple cardigan, her gray hair tucked into a neat bun. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes held a kindness that made Dr. Lawson uncomfortable. Dr. Lawson, thank you for coming, she said, holding out her hand. We're very grateful to have you here. The children don't often get access to proper medical care. He forced himself to take her hand, giving it a brief shake before releasing it. Let's just get this over with, he replied, his tone curt. Where do you need me? Sister Evelyn's smile faltered slightly, but she led him inside without comment. The orphanage was a stark contrast to the sleek, modern halls of Crestwood Hospital. The floors were scuffed, the paint peeling from the walls. But there was a sense of warmth in the air, a feeling of home that made Dr. Lawson shift uncomfortably in his starched white coat. He set up a makeshift clinic in the recreation room, using a folding table as his examination area. The children watched him with wide eyes as he unpacked his stethoscope, his blood pressure cuff, the sterile gloves that he snapped on with practiced precision. Their curiosity was palpable, mingled with a hint of wariness. The first patient was a little boy with a persistent cough. Dr. Lawson listened to his breathing with a detached expression, quickly prescribing some basic medication. He went through the motions, barely glancing at the child's face. As he moved on to the next patient, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was out of place, that he didn't belong here. A small girl with a stomach ache was next, her dark curls framing a face that was far too solemn for her age. As Dr. Lawson examined her, she flinched at his touch, her eyes darting toward Sister Evelyn, who hovered nearby. "Is he mean, Sister Evelyn?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sister Evelyn smiled gently, patting the girl's shoulder. "No, sweetheart. He's here to help." Dr. Lawson felt a twinge of discomfort at the child's question, but he buried it beneath his usual detachment. "She'll be fine. It's just a minor upset," he said briskly, scribbling a note on the chart before moving on. As the day dragged on, the sense of unease deepened. He treated scrape after scrape, listened to the children's hesitant descriptions of their symptoms, all the while keeping his gaze averted from their curious eyes. He could hear their whispers as he worked, their hushed voices carrying questions about the stranger in the white coat. By the time he finished, he was exhausted, his hands stiff from the cold and the unfamiliar strain of dealing with patients outside the sterile environment of the hospital. He scrubbed his hands in the tiny staff bathroom, staring at his reflection in the streaked mirror. He looked older than he remembered, tired, worn out. As he made his way to the door, Sister Evelyn approached him, her hands clasped in front of her. "Thank you for your time today, Doctor." "Lawson," she said, her voice warm but tinged with something he couldn't quite identify. "The children were a bit nervous, but I think they appreciated having you here." Dr. Lawson forced a tight smile. "I'm just fulfilling my obligation, Sister." Sister Evelyn nodded, but she studied him with a thoughtful expression, as if she saw something in him that even he couldn't recognize. "I hope you'll come back," she said softly. "Sometimes we find what we need in the most unexpected places." He left without responding, her words lingering in his mind as he drove back through the snow-covered streets. He told himself that he didn't care what the children thought of him, that this was just a temporary inconvenience. But the memory of the little girl's fearful question nagged at him, refusing to be pushed aside. The call came just after midnight. Dr. Lawson was lying in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, his mind replaying the events of the day. He had just begun to drift into an uneasy sleep when the phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the silence. He fumbled to the receiver, irritation sharp in his voice as he answered. "What is it?" It was Sister Evelyn, her voice thin and shaky. "Doctor Lawson, it's Marcus, one of the boys you saw today. His asthma is acting up, and we don't have the equipment to help him. I think it's getting worse." Dr. Lawson sat up, the last remnants of sleep disappearing as adrenaline surged through him. He remembered Marcus, a thin boy with large, frightened eyes. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, grabbing his coat as he hung up the phone. The drive through the snow-covered streets was treacherous, the wind howling around his car as he navigated the icy roads. He arrived at the orphanage with a skid, barely pausing to grab his bag before rushing inside. The sight that greeted him sent a jolt of fear through his chest. Marcus was curled up on a cot, his breaths coming in sharp, shallow gasps, his face pale with strain. Sister Evelyn hovered nearby, her hands fluttering with panic. "I've tried everything I know, but he's not getting better. Please, doctor. Lawson, you have to help him." Dr. Lawson knelt beside the boy, his mind snapping into focus. He retrieved an inhaler and a portable oxygen tank from his bag, administering the medication with careful precision. He monitored Marcus's vital signs, adjusted the flow of oxygen, his hands moving with a practiced speed that belied the unease in his chest. Minutes stretched into hours as he fought to stabilize the boy's breathing. Outside, the snowstorm raged on, the wind battering the windows with a relentless fury. Inside, the air was thick with tension, each labored breath a reminder of the fragility of life. Finally, Marcus's breathing began to ease, his chest rising and falling with a more even rhythm. His face, once twisted with fear, relaxed into a peaceful sleep. Dr. Lawson sat back on his heels, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders. Sister Evelyn's hands clasped together in relief, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for saving him." Dr. Lawson glanced down at Marcus, feeling a strange, unfamiliar sensation in his chest. Something that wasn't pride, but a quieter, more fragile feeling. He quickly pushed it away, telling himself that he had only done what any doctor would have done. But as he drove home through the snow-covered streets, the memory of Marcus's small, trembling hand clutching his lingered in his mind, refusing to be dismissed. Dr. Lawson returned to the orphanage the next morning, exhausted but determined to carry out his duties. He told himself he was doing this to fulfill the terms of Sarah's deal, but a new sense of obligation tugged at him, a feeling he refused to name. As he stepped into the recreation room, he found Marcus playing with a small group of children, his cheeks flushed with color, his laughter ringing out. Sister Evelyn met him at the door, her expression softening as she caught his eye. "Good morning, Doctor." "Lawson, you're back sooner than I expected." Lawson adjusted the strap of his medical bag, avoiding her gaze. "There's still a lot of work to be done. I thought I'd get started." Sister Evelyn's smile deepened, her eyes crinkling with something like pride. "The children were talking about you this morning. Marcus said you stayed with him through the night." Lawson bristled, shrugging off the compliment. "I did what I had to, that's all." But as he followed her down the hallway, past walls lined with crayon drawings and chipped paint, he felt a pang of something unfamiliar, a sense of connection, however small. The walls of the orphanage seemed to hold memories of resilience and survival, memories that contrasted sharply with the sterile, impersonal corridors of Crestwood Hospital. He spent the day treating the children, listening to their small complaints, scratches and bruises, sore throats and headaches. He found himself listening more closely to their stories, noticing the shy smiles that spread across their faces when he offered a kind word or gentle reassurance. It was a stark contrast to his usual brisk, detached manner at Crestwood. As he examined Jaden, a 7-year-old with a persistent cough, the boy looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Why do you have a fancy car, Doctor?" "Henry?" Jaden asked, his voice small. "Are you like a superhero, Doctor?" Dr. Lawson froze, caught off guard by the innocent question. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. "I'm just a doctor, Jaden," he said finally, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "I'm just here to help." Jaden nodded as if this answer made perfect sense, but the question lingered in Lawson's mind long after the boy ran off to join his friends. As the afternoon stretched into evening, he found himself thinking about the choices he had made over the years, the way he had once believed that status and wealth were the only measures of success. As he packed up his things at the end of the day, Sister Evelyn approached him, a thoughtful look in her eyes. "You know, Dr. Lawson," she began, her tone gentle, "sometimes we find our purpose in the places we least expect." Lawson hesitated, feeling a surge of defensiveness rise in his chest. "I'm not looking for a purpose, sister. I'm just doing what's necessary." Sister Evelyn's smile remained, but her eyes were knowing. "Of course, but sometimes what's necessary turns into something more." Dr. Lawson returned to Crestwood Hospital the next day, determined to put the orphanage out of his mind and focus on his work. But as he scrubbed in for surgery, the memory of Marcus's small hand gripping his lingered like an unwelcome guest, making it harder to find the sharp focus he prided himself on. Dr. Susan Patel entered the operating room, glancing at Lawson with a faintly puzzled expression. She had heard the rumors, whispers about his sudden involvement with the orphanage, the surprising decision to take on community service. She couldn't help but notice the tension in his posture, the way his hands shook slightly as he adjusted his mask. "You're looking distracted today, Doctor." "Lawson," she remarked, keeping her tone light but probing. "Everything all right?" Lawson's response was clipped, his voice carrying a defensive edge. "I'm fine, Doctor. Patel, let's just get this done." But as the surgery progressed, Lawson found it harder to ignore the weight of his own thoughts. His hands moved with their usual precision, but his mind drifted to the faces of the children he had treated at the orphanage, to the way they had looked at him with a trust he knew he hadn't earned. After the procedure, he returned to his office, closing the door behind him with more force than necessary. He sank into his chair, feeling the familiar pressure of doubt pressing against his chest. For years, he had built a wall around himself, cold, impenetrable, designed to keep emotions at bay. But now cracks were forming in that wall, letting in a flood of questions he wasn't ready to face. As he sat in the quiet of his office, his thoughts turned to Sarah Collins. He remembered the fierce determination in her eyes when she had confronted him, the quiet steel in her voice as she demanded accountability. He had dismissed her as self-righteous, but now he wondered if there was more to her than he had realized. What does she see in those kids, he wondered. Why does she care so much about people she doesn't even know? The thought made him uncomfortable, and he pushed it away with a scowl. He wasn't like her. He didn't need to justify his actions with lofty ideals. He had his own way of making a difference, one that didn't require sentimentality or attachment. But even as he tried to convince himself, the doubt remained, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. Sarah sat on her couch, cradling a cup of tea in her hands as she reviewed the latest notes from her investigation. Her back ached, and her ankles were swollen from the strain of pregnancy, but she ignored the discomfort, focusing on the task at hand. She had gathered enough evidence to make a solid case against Dr. Lawson, more than enough to justify taking him to court. But as she glanced over the photographs of patients' records, the faded copies of testimonies, she found herself thinking about the unexpected shift she had seen in Dr. Lawson during his time at the orphanage. She had kept her distance during his visits, watching from the sidelines as he interacted with the children, but she couldn't deny that he seemed different. Is it real, she wondered, or is he just trying to save his own skin? The sound of the doorbell interrupted her thoughts. She struggled to her feet, wincing as she waddled to the front door. When she opened it, she was startled to find Dr. Lawson standing on her porch, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. He held a bouquet of winter flowers, daisies and pine boughs wrapped in a simple brown paper. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Her tone was more blunt than she intended. Lawson cleared his throat, shifting his weight awkwardly. "I heard you were having a difficult time with your pregnancy. I thought these might help." Sarah stared at him, her surprise quickly giving way to suspicion. "Why do you care?" Lawson hesitated, then shrugged, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. "I don't know. Maybe I'm trying to make up for lost time, or maybe I just wanted to do something decent for once. Take it however you like." For a moment they stood in tense silence, the cold air swirling between them. Then Sarah sighed and took the flowers, her expression softening just a fraction. "Thank you, Dr. Lawson, but I'm not going to let you off the hook just because you're trying to play nice." Lawson's lips twitched into a faint, humorless smile. "I wouldn't expect you to, Agent Collins." The community center was packed, every seat filled with concerned faces and curious eyes. The town hall meeting had been called to discuss the new initiatives that Crestwood Hospital was proposing: free clinics, outreach programs, cultural sensitivity training. But as Dr. Lawson took his place in the front of the room, he could feel skepticism in the air, the weight of years of mistrust bearing down on him. Sarah stood in the back, her arms crossed over her belly, watching as Lawson adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat. She knew that this meeting was a crucial test, both for Lawson's sincerity and for the community's willingness to believe in his redemption. "Thank you for coming," Lawson began, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I'm here today because I've seen firsthand how our healthcare system fails too many people. It's time we change that." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and a hand shot up from the back. Angela Williams, a middle-aged woman with a fierce expression, rose to her feet. Sarah recognized her. She had been one of the patients who had spoken to her about Lawson's negligence years ago. "How do we know you're not just doing this to cover your own mistakes?" Angela demanded, her voice ringing through the room. "You've ignored people like us for years, Doctor." "Lawson, why should we believe you've changed?" Lawson hesitated, feeling the weight of every skeptical gaze in the room. He thought of the children at the orphanage, the warmth of Marcus's smile, the trust he had seen in their eyes. He thought of Sarah, her relentless determination to hold him accountable. And for the first time, he spoke without rehearsing his words, without hiding behind the armor of professionalism. "I can't erase what I've done," he said quietly, meeting Angela's gaze head-on. "I made mistakes, serious ones. I can't change the past, but I can try to make things right now. I know I don't deserve your trust, but I'm willing to earn it. Angela's expression softened, but doubt still shadowed her eyes. It's not enough to just say you've changed, doctor. You have to show it. Lawson nodded, the weight of her words settling in his chest. I understand, and I'll keep showing up day after day until I've proven it to you. The flu hit the orphanage like a storm, sweeping through the children with ruthless speed. One by one, they fell sick, their fevers spiking, their small bodies racked with chills and coughs. Sister Evelyn worked tirelessly, but there were too many children and not enough hands. Dr. Lawson arrived at the orphanage one icy morning to find the recreation room transformed into a makeshift infirmary. Rows of cots lined the walls, each one holding a child wrapped in blankets, their faces flushed with fever. The air was thick with the bitter scent of disinfectant and the muffled sounds of labored breathing. Sister Evelyn met him at the door, her expression tight with worry. It's bad, doctor. Worse than we've ever seen. We're running out of medicine, and we don't have enough equipment to monitor all their vitals. Lawson nodded, rolling up his sleeves. I'll do what I can. For days, he worked around the clock, caring for the children as the flu ran its course. He administered fluids, adjusted oxygen levels, monitored their symptoms with a care that surprised even himself. He felt the ache in his own back and shoulders, the exhaustion that blurred the edges of his vision, but he forced himself to keep going. On the third night, as he checked the temperature of Tina, a 6-year-old with curly hair and wide, feverish eyes, he heard her whisper in a small voice, "Are we going to be okay, Dr. Henry?" He paused, feeling the weight of her question settle in his chest. He looked down at her, seeing the trust in her eyes, the belief that he could make things better. "Yes, Tina," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're going to be okay." I promise he didn't know if he believed it, but he knew he would do everything in his power to make it true. When morning finally came, the worst of the fever had broken. The children were weak, but their breathing was easier, their faces cooler to the touch. Sister Evelyn wept with relief, clutching Lawson's hand as if it were a lifeline. "Thank you, Doctor Lawson," she whispered. "You saved them." Lawson looked around at the room full of tired but recovering children, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to change. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, a glimmer of light cutting through the darkness he had carried for so long. Dr. Lawson arrived at the orphanage on a chilly morning that held the promise of spring. The worst of the flu outbreak had passed, and though the children were still recovering, the atmosphere in the orphanage felt lighter, filled with cautious hope. As he walked inside, he saw Marcus and Jaden playing with a worn soccer ball, their laughter echoing through the air. Sister Evelyn greeted him at the entrance, her face tired but smiling. "It's good to see you, Doctor Lawson. The children have been asking about you." Lawson adjusted the strap of his medical bag, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle into his bones. He had barely slept in days, but the relief of knowing that the worst was over gave him the strength to smile back. "How are they holding up?" "Better, thanks to you," Sister Evelyn said, her eyes filling with warmth. "I don't think we would have made it through without your help." Lawson felt a strange tightness in his chest, a knot of emotion that he struggled to put into words. He had spent so long keeping himself at a distance, convincing himself that he was untouchable. But here, surrounded by these children who had come to depend on him, he couldn't ignore the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he had made a difference. As he moved through the orphanage, checking on the children, he noticed small changes in their demeanor. They greeted him with smiles, eager to show him their latest drawings or share stories about their dreams. Even Tina, who had clung to Sister Evelyn's side during his first visits, now reached out to hold his hand, her face brightening at the sight of him. Later that day, as he prepared to leave, Jaden ran up to him, clutching a crumpled piece of paper in his small hand. "Dr. Henry, look what I made for you." Lawson took the paper, unfolding it to reveal a child's drawing, stick figures of himself and the children, playing in the yard under a bright yellow sun. Above the figures, in shaky handwriting, Jaden had written, "Thank you, Dr. Henry." For a moment, Lawson couldn't speak. He looked down at the drawing, feeling a lump rise in his throat, his vision blurring at the edges. "Thank you, Jaden," he said softly, ruffling the boy's hair. "I'll keep this." As he walked back to his car, the drawing tucked safely in his pocket, he realized that he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. A sense of connection, a purpose beyond the sterile confines of his old life. It wasn't easy to admit, even to himself, but he knew that the orphanage and its children had changed him in ways he could no longer ignore. Dr. Lawson stood at the head of the boardroom table, facing a semicircle of hospital executives and department heads. The walls were lined with framed photographs of Crestwood's past achievements, celebrations of successful fundraisers, partnerships with influential politicians, awards that had cemented the hospital's reputation as one of the best in the state. But today, the mood in the room was far from celebratory. Dr. Jameson, a senior surgeon with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for conservative views, leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Henry, you've always been a practical man," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I don't understand why you're pushing for these changes. Free clinics? Outreach programs in neighborhoods that can't afford to pay? That's not what Crestwood is known for." Lawson met Jameson's gaze, feeling the familiar heat of resentment rise in his chest. But this time, he refused to let it cloud his judgment. "What we're known for doesn't matter if we're failing the people who need us most," he said firmly. "I've seen firsthand how many families go without proper care because they can't afford it. We have the resources to change that, and it's our responsibility to do so." A murmur rippled through the room, but Lawson pressed on, outlining his proposal with the same precision he brought to the operating room. He spoke of the free clinics he wanted to establish, the training programs for young doctors like Amanda Jones, who had faced barriers he had once ignored. He described the partnerships he hoped to form with local schools to offer health screenings and preventive care to underserved communities. Dr. Lisa Chen, the head of pediatrics, raised her hand. "I agree with Dr. Lawson," she said, her voice carrying a note of conviction. "We see children come into the ER all the time with conditions that could have been treated earlier if they'd had access to a clinic. It's time we start thinking beyond our bottom line." But not everyone was convinced. Dr. Stevens, a longtime member of the board, leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "This is all well and good, but how do you expect us to fund these programs, Lawson? It's going to cost money, money that we can't afford to lose." Lawson took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every skeptical gaze in the room. He thought of the children at the orphanage, of Jaden's drawing, of the hope he had seen in their eyes. "I'll find a way to make it work," he said, his voice steady. "I'm willing to take a pay cut if that's what it takes, and I'll put in the extra hours to get the clinics running." Silence fell over the boardroom, and Lawson could see the surprise in Jameson's eyes, the uncertainty in Stevens' furrowed brow. But then Dr. Chen spoke again, her voice firm. "I think we should give him a chance. We owe it to our community and to ourselves to be better." Gradually, the atmosphere in the room shifted from doubt to grudging acceptance. A vote was called, and though some board members remained skeptical, the proposal passed by a narrow margin. As the meeting adjourned, Lawson felt a surge of relief mingled with exhaustion. He knew this was just the beginning, but for the first time he believed that it was a beginning worth fighting for. Sarah sat on her couch, cradling her newborn daughter, Ella, in her arms. The baby's tiny hands curled into fists, her dark eyes wide and alert as she gazed up at her mother. Sarah stroked her daughter's cheek, marveling at the softness of her skin, the perfect curve of her tiny nose. But even as she held Ella close, a knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. She thought about the world outside, about the prejudice and neglect she had fought against for so long. She thought about the patients who had suffered under Dr. Lawson's care, the families who had lost loved ones because he had dismissed their concerns. "Will my daughter face the same struggles?" she wondered. "Will she grow up in a world that refuses to see her, to hear her?" Michael sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his expression gentle. "She's perfect, Sarah. She's going to grow up strong, just like her mom." Sarah smiled, but the worry lingered behind her eyes. "I just want to believe that things can change, that the work I've done has made a difference. But sometimes, it feels like an uphill battle." Michael kissed her temple, pulling her closer. "You've already made a difference, Sarah." You've held people accountable, and you've given Dr. Lawson a chance to become someone better. Maybe that's all we can do. Give people the chance to change. Sarah thought of Lawson, of the unexpected progress she had seen in him during his time at the orphanage. She remembered the quiet vulnerability in his eyes when he had shown up at her doorstep with flowers, the determination in his voice at the town hall meeting. Maybe he's not beyond redemption, she thought, feeling a flicker of hope warm her chest. Maybe we're all capable of change, if we're given the chance. The grounds of Bright Future Orphanage were transformed, the front lawn decorated with strings of colorful lights and tables laden with food and homemade crafts. The air was filled with the cheerful sounds of children's laughter, mingling with the murmur of conversations and the soft strains of music from a local band. It was a celebration, a community coming together to mark the opening of the new free clinic. Dr. Lawson stood near the entrance, watching as families milled about, greeting old friends and neighbors. He felt a strange sense of belonging, a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sun that shone down on them. He saw the faces of patients he had once dismissed, Angela Williams, Terrell Brooks, Maria Hernandez. But instead of hostility, their expressions were tentative, curious, as if they were seeing him for the first time. Sarah stood nearby, cradling Ella in a sling across her chest, her expression thoughtful as she watched the scene unfold. She caught Lawson's eye, and for a moment they shared a wordless understanding, a recognition of the journey they had taken, and the unexpected common ground they had found. Lawson made his way over to her, his steps careful as if he were afraid of overstepping. He looked down at Ella, who gazed back at him with wide, unblinking eyes. "She's beautiful," he said quietly, his voice rough with sincerity. Sarah nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Thank you. She's a reminder of why I do this, why we all keep fighting." Lawson nodded, glancing around at the crowd that had gathered to celebrate the clinic's opening. He thought of the children at the orphanage, of the countless families who had gone without care for too long. "I want to believe that we can keep making a difference, that it's not too late." Sarah met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw a different kind of determination in his eyes, one that came from a place of humility, of genuine desire to be better. "It's not too late," she said softly, "and you've already taken the first steps." Dr. Lawson threw himself into his new role, working alongside Sarah and Sister Evelyn to expand the free clinic's reach. He spent his weekends at the orphanage, reading to the children, helping with their homework, learning their stories. He found himself looking forward to the time he spent there, to the sense of purpose that had become a quiet but persistent part of his life. At Crestwood, he faced resistance from colleagues who still doubted his sincerity, but he no longer felt the need to justify himself to them. He focused instead on building partnerships with local schools, training medical students, and mentoring young doctors like Amanda Jones, who had once faced the same barriers he had helped create. One rainy afternoon, as he sat in his office reviewing clinic reports, he received a knock on the door. He looked up to find Tyrell Brooks standing in the doorway, a hesitant smile on his face. "I just wanted to say thank you, Dr. Lawson, for everything you've done." Lawson's throat tightened, and he found himself struggling for words. "I appreciate that, Tyrell, but I know I still have a lot to make up for." Tyrell nodded, but there was no bitterness in his eyes. "Yeah, but you're trying, and that's worth something." As Tyrell left, Lawson sat back in his chair, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over him. It wasn't absolution, not yet, but it was a start. The orphanage buzzed with life on a warm summer morning, the air filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and the sound of children's laughter. Dr. Lawson sat on the front steps, watching as Jaden and Tina chased each other through the garden, their voices rising in happy shouts. Sarah joined him, settling onto the steps beside him, Ella cradled in her arms. The baby had grown in the past few months, her chubby cheeks pink with the warmth of the sun. "Thank you, Lawson," Sarah said, her voice soft. "I never thought we'd end up here, but I'm glad we did." Lawson nodded, looking out at the scene before them. He thought of the journey that had brought them here, the mistakes he had made, the redemption he had found. "So am I," he said quietly. "I don't know if I'll ever make up for what I've done, but I'm willing to spend the rest of my life trying." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching as the children played in the sunlit yard. And for the first time in a long while, Lawson allowed himself to hope for the future, one that was not defined by his past but by the possibility of change. If you are moved by this story of transformation and hope, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story that touches the heart. And don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you believe in second chances.